Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for braving the cold. Welcome to the fourth talk of the Hollywood Institute's yearly talks. We have different talks on international affairs throughout the year. This is our fourth, and I think we might have one scheduled coming up. Our last one will be out for that as well. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Harper, professor at Temple University, but also someone with extensive experience in the Middle East, extensive experience in journalism, also extensive experience in Europe and in the U.S. He certainly has gotten around. He's worked for Newsweek and ABC. He has been stationed in Rome, Beirut, and Cairo. Right, I'm getting those correct. Beginning in the late 1970s, through the 80s into the 90s. So this is certainly someone who can also take a historical perspective on developments in the Middle East and developments in the field of journalism. Today he's talking about challenges to international journalists and international journalism in general, specifically in relation to the recent attacks, not this weekend, but the attacks in France going on the tour. Speak to those that just occurred, and their implications for international affairs and more specifically for international journalism. So with that, I won't take any more of your time. Please welcome Dr. Harper.
Thank you very much. I actually thought this was happy hour and pizza. I'd like a vodka tonic to start out. No. Thanks for coming out on this cold day. I want to thank Professors Lawrence Markowitz and Carl Hausman for having me here today. And also the President, Professor Hausman, offered that the reason I'm here is that I've reported from more hellholes than anyone he knows and have probably seen more bodies than most medical examiners. I'm not certain whether that's a compliment or not. I want to thank the Holly Bush Institute for sponsoring my talk, and thank you for all of you for coming here, even though I know most of you are forced to come here because of your classes, but I thank you anyway. I hope that you'll learn something from all of this. As you may know, Holly Bush provided a meeting place for President Lyndon Johnson and Soviet Premier Kosygin in the days after the 1967 war, a bit before you were born. That was a critical war between the Arabs and Israel, a war that led to a massive defeat for the Arab nations and the restructuring of the Middle East, and in essence, the beginning of serious guerrilla movements throughout the Middle East. It is somewhat ironic that we are discussing many of the same issues here today, nearly 50 years after those meetings. Let me address the impact of Charlie Hebdo attack by going back a few years when I started to cover terrorism. After I arrived in Beirut, Lebanon, as Newsweek bureau chief, I spent much of my time seeking out sources of information, primarily about the Palestine Liberation Organization, which dominated the politics of Lebanon and nearby countries, both economically and militarily. One of the first people I encountered was Bassam Abu Sharif, a member of the Politburo for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, probably one of the most radical Palestinian groups around. As we sat down to talk, Abu Sharif reached behind his back, pulled out a revolver, put it on the desk between us. I can tell you my questions quickly lost a lot of their edge. But over the years, Abu Sharif became an important source for me. A few years earlier, Time magazine had called him the face of terrorism. In Jordan, he had led journalists and political observers out to an airfield in Jordan where the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had hijacked 3 airplanes. They blew them all up. As a result of that, then King Hussein of Jordan launched what was called Black September to push the Palestinians out of Jordan. That name later became the title and the nom de guerre for the group that killed the Israeli athletes in Berlin during the Olympics in 1972. Abu Sharif broke with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He became a key leader to then PLO chief Yasser Arafat. He became, as I said, an important source for me on the issues pertaining to what was going on with the Palestinians. More important, one day after meeting with him in Damascus, Syria, he suggested that I take a different route back to Beirut. He told me that an American would be kidnapped that day, and the way that I was going is where someone would be kidnapped. I decided to take his advice. I went in another direction, and one of my comrades in journalism was indeed kidnapped and held for 2 years. So I thank Bassam Abu Sharif for getting me out from the hands of a group then called Hezbollah and spending a long time in a jail. In 1984, just months after 241 Americans died at the Marine compound in Beirut, ABC News wanted to do a documentary about Syria, a key backer of the attack. The attack was essentially carried out with Iran providing the financing, Syria providing the logistics, Hezbollah providing the suicide bomber, a truck bomber. The producer from New York wanted to meet with the leaders of Hezbollah, the Shia group behind the attack. I didn't like the idea because Hezbollah was a rather secretive organization. Their leaders' names were kept secret at the time. But I put feelers out to the Shia community in Lebanon. A few days later, I learned that the Beirut leaders would indeed meet with us. A car pulled up at the appointed time where we stayed, the rather famous Commodore Hotel in Beirut, where all the journalists hung out. In all war zones, there's kind of a bar where everyone goes, except in Afghanistan, where you can't drink, and people hang out. So the car pulled up, and two armed men put hoods over our head, and then we headed toward the meeting. After about half an hour, the reason for the hoods is so that we couldn't tell where we were going. I knew exactly where we were going. We were going to the suburbs of South Beirut, which is a stronghold of Hezbollah. But after the hoods came off, I saw a man I only knew as Abu Ali standing in front of the podium, and he was clearly the leader of Hezbollah in Beirut at the time. Mr. Chris, you have always treated me well. That is the only reason that we are having this meeting. Abu Ali was a baggage handler at the Commodore Hotel. I either treated him well, tipped him well, but I was certainly glad that he liked me, because otherwise I was in some deep, you know what I'm going to say. I tell these stories, first of all, because Professor Hausman said that I should tell some more stories. I apologize if they're a little old and a little boring, but they do have significance for the difference today in terms of how journalists can deal with what the rest of the world calls terrorists. Today, journalists are being executed because of their mere presence in places like Syria, or because of their cartoons and their attitudes as those in Charlie Hebdo. France does not have a First Amendment, which you may or may not know, but in their constitution, there is guarantee of freedom of expression. It's somewhat different from how we describe in the First Amendment the freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And freedom of speech and press are particularly troublesome in France and a lot of other European nations when it comes to issues of libel, defamation, and also if it involves privacy. Okay? Privacy, libel, defamation essentially trump free press in many European countries. As one of my French colleagues told me, I don't like what Charlie Hebdo does. I never have, but Charlie Hebdo is our First Amendment. However outrageous it is, it makes us feel good that it is around to remind us of the importance of freedom of expression. Let me give you some background on Charlie Hebdo. I'm sure you've heard a fair amount of this, probably not all of us since the attacks on January 7th earlier this year. Simply put, it's gotten into a lot of trouble with the government of France and with the Muslim community. It's worth noting that Charlie Hebdo was not particularly successful. Before the attacks, it sold about 60,000 copies each week. Le Canard Enchaîné, which means the chained duck or the chained newspaper, is another satirical weekly, which sells about 700,000 copies in France each Wednesday. They both come out on Wednesday, and is quite successful financially. Moreover, Charlie Hebdo is a form of French satire that has a long history, but it's really outside of our experience here. Okay? My preferences go to John Oliver, The Onion, but that's not as offensive, if you will, as Charlie Hebdo is. Charlie Hebdo and other satirists and cartoonists have provided some interesting caricatures and also some investigative journalism. Charlie Hebdo first appeared in 1970 as a successor to Harikiri magazine. As you may know, Charlie comes from Charlie Brown of Peanuts, because the cartoonists there really liked Charlie Brown. Hebdo comes from an abbreviation of weekly, hebdomadaire, and so it's really Charlie Weekly. Going back to November 1970, former French President Charles de Gaulle died in his home village of Colombey 8 days after a disaster in a nightclub. The club Cinq Sept fire, which resulted in the death of almost 150 people. The magazine Charlie, at that time, released a cover spoofing the popular press coverage of the disaster, headlined, "Tragic Ball at Colombey, 1 Dead." The French government didn't like that very much, and they closed Charlie down. In order to get around that ban, the editorial team decided to change the title to Charlie Hebdo. That ended publication in 1981. The cartoonists went to other satirical publications, and then at the beginning of the first Gulf War in 1991, Charlie Hebdo reopened. Here's how Charlie Hebdo got into trouble with Muslims. Although the Quran does not specifically state that it does not specifically ban the representation of God, Muhammad, and other idols, animals, the Muslim book does condemn idolatry. And interpreters of this phraseology have extended to a virtual ban on representing God and Muhammad in a pictorial sense, including blasphemy laws in about 50 countries throughout the world, many in Muslim countries. This has provided the quote-unquote rationale for the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and other publications. For example, on February 9th, 2006, the publication had a cover which says, Muhammad is overwhelmed by fundamentalists. And Muhammad is saying, it's really hard being loved by jerks. Okay? That didn't go over too well with the Muslim community, and neither did it go over too well with the French government. The newspaper also printed 12 cartoons from a Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, which was concerned about the Islamic rise in that country. Here are the 12 cartoons. Okay? Now, why do we here in the United States care about Danish cartoons? If you listened to the news over the weekend, if you read the newspapers over the weekend, if you read them today, okay, there was an attack on Denmark. 2 people were killed at a presentation by a Swedish cartoonist who had pictured Muhammad. It was clearly tied to a Muslim group. Okay? You may have seen that there were 21 Coptic Christians killed by the Islamic State in Libya, and Egypt retaliated. You may have read that the Iraqi army is incapable of fighting the Islamic State, and that's why Shia groups are now mounting attacks from the south, and Kurdish troops are mounting attacks from the northeast. Okay? It goes back to the notion of freedom of speech. and representation. But with this cover, the French government, and these cartoons, the French government also stepped in. So Charlie Hebdo is an equal opportunity offender, okay? Whether it's Islam, whether it is the French government. So here's what happened back then. Then French President Jacques Chirac condemned Charlie Hebdo's quote-unquote overt provocations, which could inflame passions. Anything that can hurt the convictions of someone else, in particular religious convictions, should be avoided. That's what Jacques Chirac said. That's another difference for those who are studying journalists between libel and defamation in the United States. These are criminal proceedings which almost always go toward the plaintiff, or in this case, the Grand Mosque, as opposed to the United States, where most libel defamation, you almost never see a criminal process. Okay? So the Grand Mosque of Paris began criminal proceedings against Charlie Hebdo under France's hate speech laws for publicly abusing a group on the basis of its religion. In March 2007, Le Tribunal de Paris found for the newspaper, stating that it was the fundamentalists rather than Muslims who were being ridiculed in the cartoons. But Charlie Hebdo didn't stop there. In November 2011, the magazine ran a cover in which Muhammad was depicted again. The title of the magazine was changed to Sharia Hebdo, a play on the words for Sharia or Islamic law. Muhammad was named as the editor-in-chief, and the French reads, 100 lashes if you don't die of laughter. This is a provocative magazine, no question about it. The Sharia Hebdo issue had been in response to recent news of the introduction of Sharia law in Libya, the victory of the Islamic Party in Tunisia. It focused on oppression of women under Sharia law, taking aim at domestic violence, mandatory veiling, burqas, restrictions on freedom, forced marriage, and stoning of those accused of adultery. Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius criticized the magazine. Again, it got in trouble with the government. He said, in France, there is a principle of freedom of expression which should not be underestimated. Strong emotions have been awakened in many Muslim countries. Is it really sensible or intelligence to pour oil on the fire? Even the Obama administration and the White House criticized the depiction of these cartoons. In the early hours of November 2nd, 2011, the newspaper's offices were firebombed. No one was injured. Then we move forward to January 7th, 2015, when two Islamic gunmen forced their way and opened fire into the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo, killing a total of 12. Staff cartoonists Sharb, Kabou, Honoré, Tignos, and Walensky. These are all names that you would not know, but everyone in France knows these names as the most famous cartoonists and journalists, if you will, in France. Economist Bernard Marie, editors Elsa Kaya, who was the only woman who was killed, Mustafa Arad, guest Michel Renaud, a maintenance worker Frederic Boussou, and two police officers, one in quite dramatic fashion that you probably have all seen. The two gunmen were Saïd Kouachi and Sharif Kouachi, French Muslim brothers of Algerian descent. In a separate but coordinated attack, Ahmedi Kalibali, who was from Malian descent, killed 5 people. I want to take a look at some of the other cartoons that exist here. As I said, Charlie Hebdo is an equal opportunity offender, okay? You can see the rabbi on the left, you can see the Pope in the middle, and you can see Muhammad on the right, okay? It offends everyone. And what's interesting about this headline is it says, Charlie Hebdo must be cloaked, covered, or censored, okay? It's a wonderful play on words. But as you can see, they offend everyone, okay? It's leftist, atheist, you name it, it's way out there. Right? This is the magazine cover, which you probably have seen after the massacre, which is All is Forgiven, Je suis Charlie. As I mentioned earlier, we really don't have anything similar to Charlie Hebdo in the United States. I mean, it's not Jon Stewart, it's not John Oliver, it's not, you know, it's not The Onion, but there is something that's similar that I wanted to go through with you, because it shows that Charlie Hebdo would be allowed to be printed here, as offensive as it is, okay? Hustler magazine versus Falwell was a United States court case in 1988 in which the US Supreme Court voted unanimously that the First Amendment's free speech guarantee prohibits damages being awarded to Jerry Falwell, who was a fundamentalist Protestant minister at the time. What it was a parody of Jerry Falwell. It was deemed to be within the law, even as crude as it was. So what it is the satire at issue was a takeoff on an advertising campaign for Campari, an absolutely dreadful Italian aperitif. And the Hustler parody featured a picture of Falwell and a fictional interview in which Falwell describes his first sexual experience as occurring with Mom in an outhouse, and I apologize in advance for the language here, it's not mine, I'm simply reading it, while both were drunk off their God-fearing asses on Campari. In the spoof interview, Falwell goes on to say that he was so intoxicated that Mom looked better than a Baptist whore with a $100 donation, and that he decided to have sex with Mother because he had showed off all the other guys in town. He had heard that all the other guys in town had such a good time. And they had intercourse frequently afterwards. Finally, when asked if he had tried Campari since, Falwell answered, quote, "I always get sloshed before I go out on the pulpit. You don't think I could lay down all that bullshit sober, do you?" The ad carried a disclaimer that it was fiction and that it was parody. And the US Supreme Court said, however offensive this is, it is covered by the First Amendment. That's about as obnoxious as that, okay? And so it's my consideration that it would be covered, and I play a lawyer at Temple University School of Media and Communications. I talk about media law. So it would have protection, but I don't think it would have much of a market here. So let me look at some of the implications for journalists, not only who cover issues in France, but issues in the Middle East, and how it affects us here. Several prominent news organizations engaged in self-censorship after the attacks. That's a troublesome response, okay? I could be executed, stoned, placed in jail if I did this in any Muslim country, to show you these cartoons, okay? But the only way that you as viewers can understand what I'm talking about, and the only way that I think that news readers, online readers, television viewers can have an understanding of this issue, is if major news organizations provide some sense of what these are about. A variety of news organizations, including the New York Times, CNN, NBC, the British Broadcasting Company, decided not to use the cartoons for two reasons. One, the use of the material might put journalists who work for these organizations in danger. Some readers and viewers, the second reason, might find them offensive. I don't know about you, but I generally find things in the New York Times, at least 2 or 3 offensive every day. But I guess that the executive editor doesn't worry too much about me. Jeff Jarvis, with whom I rarely agree, said something I agree with wholeheartedly. He works for the City University of New York. This is what he had to say about the Times decision. If you're a paper of record, if you're the highest exemplar of American journalist, if you expect others to stand by your journalists when they are threatened, if you respect your audience to make up its mind, then damn it, stand by Charlie Hebdo. Inform your public. Run the cartoons. The New York Times did some incredible somersaults in order to come up with a bad decision. First of all, Executive Dean Paquette said he checked with foreign reporters to determine if they thought that they would be in danger. All of them said, "No." Okay. He moved on. He determined that the images would offend Muslim readers or online viewers. Here is what he told the news organization's public editor, Margaret Sullivan. "We have a standard that is long held and that serves us well, and that there will be a line between gratuitous insult and satire. Most of these cartoons are gratuitous insult." I apologize, I broke my glasses last night by sitting on them, and I have my wife's glasses on, so from time to time I'm going to have to pick it up here. The executive editor went on, "At what point does news value override our standards? You would have to show the most incendiary images from the newspaper, and that is something I deem unacceptable." Both reasons seem absolutely lame to me. It really isn't possible for readers and viewers to ascertain the point of the attack without seeing the cartoons. Furthermore, Western journalists already face dangers from Islamic groups, as evidenced by the American reporters executed by the Islamic State. Also, Islamist groups make little distinction between various news organizations and generally consider a journalist as either working for the government or as a spy. Okay? I find something offensive, as I said, in the New York Times every day, but he doesn't really worry about me. Maybe you find nothing offensive in any of the newspapers or on television. I doubt that. But if something being offensive should be the basis for a decision to eliminate these images in such an important case, I find troubling. I'm reminded of some really old stories which are similar to this, and they go back to rather prudish times in our history, when the New York Times said during the 1968 Chicago convention that the protesters hurled foul epithets at the police. They didn't say what the foul epithets were. Everybody was trying to figure out what the foul epithets were. Okay? Similarly, in 1973, the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, under Richard Nixon, told a racist joke, and he was fired for that. Nobody printed the racist joke. The entire American public had absolutely no idea why a member of the administration had been fired because we didn't know what the joke was. I think that's horrific. The new editor of Charlie Hebdo after the attack was absolutely outraged at what happened. Gerard Biard told NBC's Meet the Press, "We cannot blame newspapers that already suffer much difficulty in getting published and distributed in totalitarian regimes for not publishing a cartoon which could cost them time in jail and at worst death. On the other hand, newspapers which are published in democratic countries, they don't face death, they don't face jail time. This cartoon is not just a little figure, it's a symbol. It's the symbol of freedom of speech, of freedom of religion, of democracy and secularism. If it is the symbol that these newspapers refuse to publish, that is what they must understand. When they refuse to publish this cartoon, when they blur it out, when they decline to publish it, they blur out democracy, secularism, freedom of religion, and they insult the citizenship. As consumers of news, you may not have known it, but you probably faced one of the worst examples of international reporting that I've seen in my lifetime. I'm 63 and I've seen a lot of bad reporting, okay? And trust me, more of it from professionals than from students, okay? In the days after the attack, I read a weekly media column for the Washington Times. I underlined the impact of cutbacks in international bureaus and many news organizations, particularly among the U.S. television networks. I used to work for ABC News. I was Rome Bureau Chief, I was Cairo Bureau Chief. The The networks also made some horrific errors. NBC's Pete Williams committed the most egregious one. He announced 2 days before the terrorists were killed, they had died. He blamed it on his poor anonymous sources rather than taking blame that he reported the story badly. Fox News analyst Stephen Emerson provided the second biggest mistake when he described the British city of Birmingham in the UK, which has 1.5 million people, as quote-unquote totally Muslim, and as a locale where non-Muslims simply don't go. That came as a surprise to the 80% of the non-Muslims who lived in Birmingham. Fox also reported that there were no-go zones in Paris. And Le Petit Journal did a really great takedown.
Le Fox News qui disent n'importe quoi sur la France ont bravé tous les dangers et sont allés vérifier leurs sources aujourd'hui.
Paris is the most dangerous city in the universe. Hey, Max, what's your background? This is an Islamist. Oh my God, he's gonna be my God. Oh my God, it's a very dangerous Islamist. He wants to kill us. It's very dangerous. Trust me, Paris is very dangerous. Oh my God, a couscous. Oh God, there is Islamist, there is terrorist. Oh my God, I'm afraid of Iran. Paris is a no-go zone. Please run like Iran. This is a bad idea.
Okay. What became apparent during the coverage of the was the lack of understanding of France by many of the reporters who'd parachuted in from New York and London. That's because CBS, NBC, and Fox no longer have staff members based in Paris. That doesn't translate into solid reporting about a massive story such as the Paris attacks. When I headed bureaus for Newsweek in Beirut, ABC News in Cairo and Rome, I supervised talented staffs that understood their home countries and the surrounding ones. In Paris, the ABC News Bureau had 3 of the most outstanding camera crews known in the history of television. They've all been pushed out and forced to retire. I spent much of the time watching France24.com. In the English version, my French has faded rather badly. But I often find when a major event like this happens, it's better to go to a source that's closer to the scene. And I found that France24.com really provided me not only with the news, but an analysis of what was going on. I find that with like Oklahoma City tornadoes, okay? They're the ones with the sources. I found it with the Boston Marathon bombing. I watch stuff in Boston, and I would encourage you as a news consumer to go to more localized places in order to find coverage. The number of journalists throughout the world have dropped about 25% over the past 10 years. And the amount of news coverage on the major networks has dropped about 50% from 1990 to today, despite the fact that many people still want international news. Now, I know that you have gone through some of the materials with respect to Islam, but I just have to go through it to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay. Sunni Islam. Major part of Islam, about more than 1 million adherents out of the 1.6. Sunni means well-trodden path or tradition, the vast majority of Islams. Sunnis believe that Abu Bakr, who is the father-in-law of Muhammad and a technocrat military leader, should be the successor to Muhammad. A subset of Sunni Islam is Salafism or Salafis, which takes its name from Salaf. The term means predecessors or ancestors and used to identify early Muslims. This is tied to Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. It essentially means that the groups and many of the jihadi groups want to go back to the fundamental lives in the 7th and 8th centuries or just after the founding of Islam. Okay? So here are our groups. Okay? Al-Qaeda, which means the base is headed by Ayman Zawahiri after the death of Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP chief Nasser al-Wahasi is Al-Qaeda's number 2. and was designated as al-Zawahiri's global deputy in 2013. Jabhat al-Nusra, which is still tied to main al-Qaeda, is headed by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and then the Islamic State, which is split from al-Qaeda and these other groups, is headed by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Let me try an analogy. I don't know whether it works or not, but maybe it will give you a bit of an understanding to al-Qaeda, which was 9/11, and the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda is like Microsoft. It's old and not particularly appealing to the young. The Islamic State is more like the latest war video game and is therefore more appealing to those who want to be involved in the Islamic jihadists. Shia Islam means partisans or partisans of Ali. The Shia have come to power in a variety of places. In Iran, 1979, under Ayatollah Khomeini. In Syria, President Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, which is a subset of Shia Islam. The Assad regime is not religious, but socialist and pan-Arab. It's backed by Iran and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is particularly powerful in Lebanon. And then you have a new group, but not necessarily a new group, but someone new on the scene in terms of who's on our radar. The Houthis, a tribal group that's now in control of the north. What's ironic is that you have the Houthis have Sana'a and the north, and al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula have the south. Okay? So you have the United States and other people pulling out their embassies in what was once called the best transition to democratic politics by President Obama. So with this background, it's also important to keep in mind the Sunnis hate the Shias hate the Sunnis, and the Sunnis and the Shia hate us even more. Okay? So we have a problem. It's always difficult to try and classify and analyze terrorism because we don't have a lot of human intelligence. We have technical intelligence, but we don't have a lot of people who are actually inside to provide us with information. But there's a fellow by the name of Clint Watts, who's been a longtime analyst of terrorism, who also has probably one of the best URLs I've ever heard of. It's called warontherocks.com. And he writes extensively about terrorism. And here's what Clint has to say. He's basically taken and looked at various types of attacks. Okay? A directed attack, a clear example is 9/11. It is directed by a core, well-trained individuals and financed by something like Al-Qaeda. Okay? Or the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen was financed, coordinated, and done by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The attacks in Barcelona, the attacks in London, these are all examples of directed attacks. We haven't really seen many of those in recent years. Then what we have is what are called the networked attacks, and the one in Denmark, it's a little bit different. I'll keep Denmark out of this. Charlie Hebdo is a very clear directed attack in terms of terrorism. So that there is a cooperation between training of individuals, either through training camps in Yemen or in Syria and Iraq, and then those individuals are sent back with specific instructions and some funding to do attacks like Charlie Hebdo. This is likely to become more and more prevalent throughout Europe. Okay? Then there's what are called the inspired attacks. These are essentially the lone wolf attacks. Denmark is an example of that, where through social media, through Ahmed al-Awlaki, who was an English-speaking cleric who was killed in Yemen, there is kind of self-jihadism, where people will go online, they will listen to speeches, and they will get some training on their own, and then they will essentially go out as lone wolves. Okay? We've seen this in Australia, we've seen this in Canada, we've seen this probably in New York, okay? Although although the mayor there is not willing to say it quite yet, in Denmark over the weekend. And these are likely to be more and more attacks that we'll see like this, okay? They're dangerous, obviously, to the individuals who are killed, but they don't generate the type of publicity, or they lack the sophistication that other attacks have. But these are the types that we will tend to see in the future more and more. Okay? There are some important questions. How will the jihadis respond? Al-Qaeda, as I said, has been unable to launch a significant attack for a long time. But with attacks like Charlie Hebdo and also the Boston Marathon, with a relatively unsophisticated arsenal, there have been a number of attacks like that that have gotten maximum exposure and maximum coverage. I wanted to talk about the number of fighters that are moving back and forth. It's difficult to get a number on what the total number of Islamic forces are, somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000. Okay? Here are the numbers of foreign fighters. Tunisia, 3,000, Saudi Arabia, 2,500, Morocco, Lebanon, Russia, France, 750, UK, 500. And these are going to expand more and more as we go along. And there's also been a total disconnect between the countries in Europe and the Islamic communities. Simply put, I have more information on this, but I want to give us some time to talk a little bit, is that the people who are not Muslim in Europe overestimate the size of the Islamic community by about 3 times. So if you take France, for example, where 7% of the population is Islamic, most non-Muslims will say it's about 25%. There's clearly a fear factor there. And over the weekend, there were desecration of Jewish graves and synagogues, and you're likely to see more of that in the future. Alternatively, the number of Muslims who dislike the Europeans have grown significantly. So in the most recent figures we have, about 7% of the 1.6 million people, so 1.6 billion Muslims, think that 9/11 was totally justified. 30% think it was partially justified. 23% say they hate America, okay? Those are pretty staggering figures of between 135 million people say 9/11 was justified, and up to 450 million who think it was partially justified, and about 350 million people who hate America. Those figures may come home to roost, and there's not any significant trend that seems to be able to stop it. Okay? I want to show you one very interesting way that you can take a look about how reporting is being done about ISIS, or the self-proclaimed Islamic State, and also the Ukraine and Iraq. It's called Bellingcat.com. And what this is that it was set up by a stay-at-home dad who decided to take all of the YouTube videos, Facebook posts on a variety of sites, and geolocate all of these various incidents. In fact, he was able to locate the sarin attacks in Syria before the United Nations. Okay? So I would suggest that you go back to take a look at Bellingcat to take a look at what he's done. Finally, the Charlie Hebdo attack will resonate for many months, if not years to come. Monitoring the pace and type of attacks directed and networked by both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will illuminate how jihadis compete and cooperate in the coming years. More important, the Paris attacks make clear that the West will finally need to address some significant problems that we've largely sidestepped in the years behind us. Thank you very much. Sorry that I went a little over time, but please.